because I know many of you are here to, be interested in the training in Ljubljana, but for sure some are also here just to use the opportunity to get to know NARM a bit better, which is completely fine and also welcome. And so I thought I would like to share with you a bit the place where I'm coming from, or what brought me to teaching NARM, but less as a teacher, more as a therapist. Because I was, oh, now I see only myself. I have to change this. Okay. So where my training background or my education, comes from, I was in the generation, the first generation, I guess, in Germany of psychology students, where almost all faculties, all universities were firmly in the hand of cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's still the case. I don't know how that is in the country you're living, but in Germany and in many German-speaking countries, that's the case. So the universities are all about CBT. And I also did a clinical training in CBT. And I had my reasons to do it because I was really interested in the clinical work, in psychiatric work, to get to know this. But I was also struggling a lot with this approach. Not because it doesn't have its place or it's not effective, but I was, even in my own training, in my own CBT training, very much looking into humanistic approaches, Gestalt work, trying to take supervisions with psychodynamic therapists. Because the let's say medical or mechanic way of looking at processes or clients, it didn't speak to me on a deeper level. So I felt, even when I was in my own training, very drawn to humanistic therapies, because the way how humanistic approaches hold development, change, or what we call pathologies, was always speaking to me a lot. But then at the same time, I felt the basic assumptions of the human condition in humanistic therapy that was very resonant with me. But I felt it didn't meet really the complexity of how challenging it can be to work with people, and how complex it can be, what's getting in the way of change, what some approaches call defense mechanisms, or and then of course there's this whole big psychodynamic tradition, which is very much detail looking at the complexity of psyche. But having had experiences also as a client myself with psychodynamic therapies, I was bothered by that the clinical application felt very interpretive for me. And I know that doesn't go for anyone. I don't want to offend any psychodynamic therapists. Psychodynamic therapy is great. But the clinical application can be leaning towards interpreting what's going on. And when I found NARM, that was around 12 years ago, many different things I learned came together for me. Because there was a model that had a very deep humanistic heart in terms of holding the potential for post-traumatic growth and healing. But it's also quite sophisticated in the way it can work with people in the here and now. So there's a system how to work with it. But at the same time, it's process oriented, and it's not trying to bring people from A to B to C. And just this whole constellation for me was more or less my therapeutic homecoming to a system that I could say, okay, this system is something that I can take in the center of my clinical work and see how other approaches are are landing in that. And one other thing that was why I was really drawn to NARM is that I was interested in the most early challenges of development and what it does to people who are dealing with these very early developmental trauma challenges, and how restoring it can be if you have a therapist that can address these things, and how much suffering there can be if you carry this for many years around, not knowing what's going on, especially if it's in the realm of pre-verbal atmospheres, sense of feeling wrong or bad, and you cannot quite put your finger on it. And that's something else why I felt very drawn to the model of NARM. So I thought to take you a bit through the basic pillars of NARM today, and I will use PowerPoint slides for that. In the training, I won't use PowerPoint slides extensively, but in an online setting, that's quite useful to have a bit of a structure because we can have less interaction here. So, and as Nick already said, there will be a point where you can have a bit of an exchange, and also there will, of course, be time for questions. If you have a question anytime, just write it in the chat, and maybe we can integrate it, yeah, in the presentation. So maybe you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see a slide. Thank you. That's great. Okay. So let's talk about trauma first, because NARM is a training for developmental trauma, but it defines trauma not in the sense that the clinical diagnosis post-traumatic stress disorder is defined, but the definition of trauma in NARM is more broad. Basically, NARM considers a developmental trauma every developmental challenge a child had to go through that it could only go through by compromising central aspects of our authentic and natural self. So in other words, something that affects all of our development. There's nobody here who would not have something that we call here developmental trauma, because there's no such thing as a perfect attachment relationship. So it's quite a broad definition of trauma that goes beyond the clinical diagnosis of PTSD, and has a good overlap with complex PTSD. But I will not go into the details of complex PTSD today, because we would need to take a bit some time what NARM can address there and what might be overlapping symptoms that that can also go beyond this model. But for now, let's take this definition of a trauma. And how NARM looks at trauma is that developmental trauma means there are two main phenomena that we need to address and effectively work with them. And that's dysregulation of the nervous system and distortion of identity. So what we mean by dysregulation of the nervous system is that those environmental failures where we were too young to process, hold them on our own, they leave layers or pockets of dysregulation in our nervous system. And there have been thousands of books and articles in the last decade published on this. Polyvagal theory, somatic experiencing, the body keeps the score. There's so much written on how to systematically help people to regulate when they're in dysregulated states. And there are many therapeutic approaches that deal with that. But the more challenging clinical aspect is not the regulation piece, but it's the distortion piece. It is the who we take ourselves to be, and what's the self-image and what's the belief about myself I adopt as a child in order to deal with these challenges. Because it's these distorted beliefs that keep perpetuating day to day my experience and how I relate to myself. So this is clinically the much more challenging part of how to work with that in an effective way. Because from a NARM perspective, and NARM is not alone in that, trauma is not what happened. And I know that's probably not new to many of you. But trauma is the adaptation that the child had to undergo, or to, the adaptation it had to install in order to deal with the effects of the trauma. And by trauma here, we mean chronic failure of attunement, of safety, chronic relational experiences, whether it's abuse, whether it's neglect, whether it's misattunement, but something that happens over and over and over. It's not this one big event. It's a relational chronicity. And the way every child deals with that is through guilt and shame. And so you will get to understand that guilt and shame is at the core of the clinical understanding of how we view developmental trauma. Because one central piece of the model is what we call core dilemma. And the core dilemma of the child is basically that the child doesn't just need attachment, it also needs to stay true to its authentic self. And these two big driving forces, they bring us into an unsolvable dilemma if our authentic expression risks the relationship we depend on.
Okay.
So it's one thing if you have to survive a threat from a stranger and a horrible event as an adult or as a child. But the other thing is, if you imagine just what it would mean if you need to uphold the relationship to the source of what's the challenge for you, to the source of misattunement, to the source of neglect, to the source of abuse. And you need to maintain this relationship. So that's only possible by splitting off these essential parts. And when you see a child or kind of healthy children, you will see that they respond with protest. And if it's not met, there will be more protest and more, and there will be anger. And then there's rage. But these nervous systems are small. And there's a lot of charge in being very angry towards these persons that you depend on. And it's scary. It's not just scary because the parents might be overwhelmed and overreact. It's also just scary for a child to feel anger to the persons that it loves. Feeling itself is scary. So then what happens is that this anger or this protest is actually acted in, and that happens in the form of shame and guilt. So you will come to see that how we address shame is very central to how we support clients. So because we have these two levels, if you want to work effectively, kind of you need to address both of these processes. There are what we call bottom-up processes. And that is that something that cannot be put in words yet, or something that is more happening on a somatic, on a felt sense level, has a space to show up and can find its way into verbalizing or into relationship. These are the moments in therapy where it's not about giving a lot in, but it's sometimes the challenge for therapists is to be quiet for a moment and to know when it's better to just pause and see if something is about just to announce itself and maybe come into the foreground. And the whole top-down processing part means that how we relate to our experience shapes it in the here and now. So we are making clients aware how they relate to their experience while we are in the experience together. Because you can talk many hours about, you know, how they relate not so empathically with themselves and how they know that that's not really what they want, but you can theoretically talk a lot about that or reflect that. But it's a different thing to explore it in the moment when it's happening in the session. And when we say trauma is not the event, but trauma is the adaptation that the child had to, you know, to do in order to deal with it. The adaptation is the shaming and self-rejecting and self-hating response. That's how the past shows up in the here and now. So the trauma is not something there. It's not something we can point to. Like, here's the developmental trauma. That's the tricky part of working with developmental trauma. It's not something we can both point to. It's the lens we look through. It's the way we relate to our emotions. It's the way we hold our experience. That's where we find the traces of developmental trauma. So this is very crucial part, what we call agency in NARM, to address what are you doing to yourself? How are you looking at yourself in this moment? Which, of course, also only is possible if we use the here and now. So these are a few clinical aspects that I would consider very core to the model. And one is that many psychotherapies focus on the attachment process and how important it is. And not so many put the individuation and separation process in the focus. Because attachment, the need to be held and loved, that's one thing. But the need to be authentic in my expression is equally strong. And when you work with clients, you can see that in these moments they allow themselves a little bit of individuation, separation. You will see that immediately a shame response or a self-rejecting response comes in. This is so reliable that you can actually use that as a clinical orientation in therapeutic sessions. You can just see when people start to shame themselves. And then see what just happened before. Where did somebody just allow him or herself something more vulnerable, something more daring, something more honest? Because from the child's perspective, what we call child consciousness in NARM, that these little steps of individuation, of being a bit more honest with my experience, they immediately trigger the fear of the loss of the attachment relationship. And this is the reason while goal orientation is not compatible with process-oriented work and with working with developmental trauma. Because the more goal-oriented you get as a therapist, the more fear you activate in the child consciousness of the client. That's why being not goal-oriented is at the heart of the model. It's not just a philosophy, it's a direct consequence of understanding the core dilemma. So we already addressed that a few times, recognizing the vital role in the chronification of core beliefs. Because these distorted identities are not so strong and so solid because what happened in the past was so intense, but they are so strong and so solid because the self-shaming process keeps confirming itself every time again. And that solidifies who we believe ourselves to be. When you believe that you're not worthy of support or of love, you will find those cues in the faces of other people that will confirm that. And you can have all the corrective experiences in the world, in groups, in individual therapy. They will not get to the core of your sense of self when you hold the belief that you're not worthy of receiving that. It's not possible. That's why cathartic work and working with so-called corrective experiences, the prerequisite is that we address the shame, and that shame can open first. Because there's no experience that can penetrate that if that's in place. We will just find a reason why it's not really about us, or maybe that's not genuine. We will find ways how to tell ourselves that that's actually not meant for us. The next thing is the here and now part. And that really has to do with that. One thing is to reflect our self-image. And the other thing is to work with the sense of self. And they are wired differently also in our brain. We can reflect our self-image in therapeutic ways over many years, but it doesn't mean that our sense of self, so how we actually experience ourselves, changes. And when you work as a therapist, you for sure have many clients who already told you, I've done a lot of work, I understood everything about me, I still struggle, and I feel even more bad because knowing all of this, shouldn't I then be able to change it? So there's more shame. But it's nothing to do with the client. It's to do with, it cannot be solved by reflection. The access gate for the sense of self is here and now. Because it works with the implicit memory, not the explicit memory. It's not a narrative. It's a sense that we can explore and deepen together in the here and now, but only in the here and now. And maybe that sounds, not so easy to follow or complex, but it will become very clear in the course of the training why that's the case. And maybe you even have personal experience as a client or as a therapist. So, and the other thing that's very central to NARM is the containment piece that relates to the inner posture that we do not push our own agenda as a therapist. We don't become goal-oriented, and we don't attempt to regulate clients' states. There are at least two reasons for that. One is especially for the more early survival styles, inducing states can be overwhelming. Even if they're, or especially if they're expansive, or, you know, in NARM, we don't try to bring people into their bodies. We don't try to connect them with their feelings. We don't try to elicit anger from them, but we explore the fear of being angry, for example. There's a quote from Larry, from Lawrence Heller, that I really like, that describes this. And he said, the defense, what we call defense, has nothing to do with resistance and everything to do with fear. So what has been in some traditions kind of almost been normal to pathologize clients that they go into so-called resistance, from my point of view, it's just a lack of understanding of the core dilemma. It's not a lack of motivation. It's not a lack of willingness. It's also not a lack of capacity. It is just how the core dilemma is built. And the more goal-oriented you get as a therapist, the stronger this phenomenon becomes. And the earlier the traumatization, the more sensitive the client will be to your goal orientation. So the earlier the trauma I'm dealing with, the more allergic I will feel when somebody wants to take me somewhere in the session. Just intuitively. I don't even need to think about that. The nervous system picks up on that immediately. So that's important to consider. And this non-goal orienting aspect is basically also rooted in this philosophy that has been, you know, the root of the first NARM model and the first book that was published. And that is that the spontaneous movement towards connection, health, aliveness is the driving force in us. That's what we call life force, and not just us. But it means to really hold this inner sense that no matter how withdrawn somebody is, how isolated, how serious a trauma was, that on a deepest level, there is a movement towards health. And we are not responsible of directing it, of pushing it. And this is not related to technique. That's just related to how you hold change and how you hold human beings on the deepest level, who they are. And is there something beyond pathology, beyond strategies, that carries some kind of self-organizing intelligence? So, and here this is just compared to this plant who is moving spontaneously to the sunlight, you know, it will do that until we die. And even with clients, I just had a supervision today with a very, very, very compromised a psychiatric client, and it's so easy when you work with these people that you could just see symptoms, 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 symptoms. And the moments where this life force knocks on the door, they are so fleeting. You have to train your perception to notice the moments where actually something else comes through. It's always there. It's just a matter how you can attune to it and how you can listen to it. So if we get more and more rooted in this basic assumption, and the more trust there is for us as therapists, the less we try to push to bring the process somewhere where it maybe is not ready yet, or there are good reasons not to connect to a certain emotion yet. Yeah. Okay. So we thought that because I'm already talking since a while, we just wanted to bring in a short contemplation that you can use for yourself. That's directly connected to this life force element and to how efforting can get in the way of being in touch with this life force. So the invitation is to just take a short, moment for yourself and think of a time. You can also write down, or you can disengage from the screen. You can give yourself a little bit of a break from theoretical content. So think of a time when support and connection arrived without effort for you. And how that was like inside. Something that happened in your favor, not because you managed to do it, but it just happened for you. And feel free to observe yourself somatically, emotionally, energetically. Maybe you also notice that you also push or have a demand right now that you should find a really good moment. Or maybe there's some self-talk there. Just see what be curious what happens there. And if something is showing up, maybe you can experience firsthand what we call shifts in NARM. And these are the moments where something energetically, emotionally, somatically just changes, and there's either more relaxation or more being moved or touched or more expansion. And so in the training, we actually learn to track these shifts because they are the orientation for process oriented work. You cannot work process oriented by the narrative. You have to look for the parameters that the body and the nervous system signal to you. And we use this, so-called shifts in NARM to organize our understanding of what's happening or what's not happening. Right. So if we look at NARM as an approach of a whole, one could say that there's a developmental theory it draws from that's very much informed by uh, psychodynamic understanding. And that is around the core, how central this core dilemma is that we already now talked about, and the process of identification. So that the child starts to identify with a painful and shameful self image, being wrong, being bad. And then on top of this shame based identification, in order to deal with this sense of feeling being bad, there's this what we call pride based identification. So if I'm very wrong or defected here, here's how I should be, or here's where I should orient towards. You know, if it was a no-go in my family to reach out when I don't know how to do things, or I need just help with something, I can't do it on my own, and that was shamed or rejected or whatever. Of course, I will internalize this shame around me needing support. So I will develop this pride-based strategy of being very self-sufficient, and that works then quite well for many years. But it comes with a price. So there's the developmental theory around the core dilemma and how these identifications develop and how we address them in the clinical work. And there's something in NARM, we don't call it like that, a personality model, because personality sounds so fixed. We say these are 5 adaptive survival styles. But of course, what we call personality is just the fabric of these survival styles. I mean, what is a personality? It's the deeper elements of who we are and our essence and genuine deeper qualities, but they are also mixed with these compensations we learned and these what we call survival styles. The clinical orientation are the so-called 4 pillars. I will say more to them in a minute. And then we use organizing principles to inform our understanding during the work. So, for example, we might track when there's more disconnection happening and when something feels more connected, and then we get curious around that. And again, we do this by observing shifts. And another important element is emotional completion. I will talk a lot about that in the training and a little bit less here because we would need some more time with that. But in a nutshell and very reduced in its complexity, you could say that this identification happens when the shamed experience and the relational message it holds to the environment can express itself again and not be constantly pushed down and rejected. And another way of saying that is that all of these survival styles are based on emotional avoidance. Because where we shame ourselves, we avoid primary emotions. And this is so key to the model that shame is not an emotion. But shame is a relational process, an internal relational process. It's a strategy not to get in touch with what we feel. So when we say to ask a client, how do you feel? And the client says, I feel shame. It's usually not so helpful to give space to the shame just by being empathic with it. Because it's not a primary emotion. It is a way of avoiding something else, of not getting in touch with. And this makes such a big difference in working with developmental trauma once you understand this dynamic. And I can be transparent with you. Before I got into this NARM work, shame didn't play any role in my therapeutic understanding. I knew grief is important, fear, of course, all the other emotions, anger, but shame was relatively blank spot for me for a long time. And it turns out it's at the core of every identification. You can actually the sense of being wrong is actually not possible when you're connected to yourself. You cannot be connected to yourself and feel wrong. Because feeling wrong is not a feeling. It's the byproduct of disconnection. So naturally, when you connect more to your core, the sense of wrongness, it will change. Because it doesn't have substance as a feeling in itself. It's not a feeling. It's a sign of disconnection. So this is the main clinical orientation in NARM. These are the 4 pillars. And I think they're designed in quite a great way because, of course, NARM is a method, but it's also not a method. You could say NARM offers principles like these 4. But these principles leave enough space to respect the process as it happens. You need an orientation, but if the orientation kills the process, then you kind of everything collapses into a mechanic work. We don't want that. It's a relational model. So you need these orientation points to work, but you also need to respect and follow the process as it comes up. And these 4 pillars do kind of a nice job in being a structure, but at the same time, breathing enough that you don't feel a method is applied on you. Which again, when you're dealing with trauma or with early trauma, it's the most aversive feeling you can have being in therapy, and for good reasons. That was one thing when I got to know NARM that I liked so much, is that it clarifies an intention. And before I was doing a lot of Gestalt work, and in Gestalt you open the theme and you see what comes up as a Gestalt in the foreground. You basically you go with what the organism brings forth. And that can be, on a deep way, lead to experiential openings. But sometimes you really end up somewhere far away of what people would want, because there's so much developmental trauma in us. If we just open the space, something will always happen. But the question is, what do you wish for yourself in your life right now? And what is really getting in the way of that wish? So we form an intention in this first pillar. And an intention is not a goal. An intention is a direction, an energetic trajectory. It's not a fixed point. For example, when people say, I want to be able to speak up to my boss tomorrow in the meeting, that would be a goal. That would be kind of a fixed point. And then when we say, okay, let's help you to speak up tomorrow, and then they come the next session and they say, oh, I didn't speak up. I feel so bad. I couldn't do it. I'm not there yet. And then there's this shaming and this self-rejection going on. So when you agree on goals, you will always have this, will I succeed or fail, right? But an intention is more subtle, but it's still connected to the will. For example, we would ask, what if you would be able to speak up to your boss, what would that mean to you, or what would you hope to get from that? And then client might say, I think I would feel a bit more confident at work. And then we could say, let's explore what's getting in the way of you having access to some confidence in this work context, independent whether you will be able to speak up tomorrow or not. So we go beyond the behavior success failure, and we see, yeah, maybe that seems to be the deeper capacity or intention you have for yourself. And if you will speak up to your boss tomorrow or not, that's not so much our concern right now. But still, there's a direction. I wanna work in a certain direction, right? And then in the second pillar, we kind of really deconstruct these moments. It would take us too much time to go into the details, and you will learn all about that in the training if you choose to come. But this asking questions is really based on this orientation around curiosity. And I can tell you already, one challenge and one great thing if you are in the NARM training is that you are actually invited to explore with your curiosity, being in a resonant process with the client, and you cannot rely at all times on step A, B, C. Because if we work relationally, we need to also rely on our spontaneous and curious impulses. And that's very great. And that's also quite a challenge when you move into that paradigm as a therapist, or when you're used to work method based a lot. It's because it brings a certain vulnerability to show up in front of peers and in front of assistants. And you're not just being there learning a model, you're being supported in seeing what happens in you when you're sitting with a client. So it's both. It's a really great way to learn, and it's in order to do that, there needs to be a good learning culture, how we deal with this natural kind of, let's say, vulnerability of showing up not just as a therapist, but as a person being a therapist, right? So that's so much for now, maybe for the second pillar. And I also said something about reinforcing agency and reflecting these shifts. So maybe we can, for a moment, look at this part that I already named a little bit. It relates to this first pillar, and it means that working with intention does not mean to get goal oriented, And agreeing on an intention makes sure that the process doesn't get arbitrary, random, that we don't just follow random associations, but we hold an intention. We hold the intention of the client, but we also are intentional as therapists. We want to help somebody, even if we don't want to push somebody somewhere. We want to support somebody. That's already an intention, but that doesn't mean that we get goal oriented. And that's again how Lawrence Heller put it in nice words as usual. We want to hold the possibility for our clients, but we don't make them go there. And holding a possibility, it is also like an intention, you know. You see a possibility here for a client, maybe some anger flares up and you could see, that might be helpful for this person to connect to. But you don't have an agenda that that person needs to connect to it right now. You just offer an impulse. And then you also see, is there a capacity to relate to it? Is there a going away from it? And then we could just get curious around this. But for me, intentionality is a very interesting, basically like an inner tool to work with, because it gives direction without fixing the process on an outcome. And we are in service of the intention of the client, and we are also intentional as therapists. We can even be directive, but we don't push for change. We can say 3 times, wait a moment, let's go back there. And I want to go back there again. There was this moment where you know, your face changed a little bit. I'm still curious about that moment. We can do that 3 times, be persistent, but we are open with the outcome. Because we are also part of the process. It's not just we help somebody over there. We are in it. We have our own impulses, that our own heart that is in resonance, that's vital to the process. Otherwise, again, it becomes mechanic. And also, we're not just exploring, we form working hypotheses. We hold a working hypothesis of a client where we try to see what's maybe the core need or the relational expression that wants to come through but is rejected or shamed or meets self-hate again and again. And we orient towards these hypotheses. And I guess most of you know these adaptive survival styles, these 5 who came forth from the tradition of neo-Reichian work of Reich and Alexander Lowen, that were the character structures that has less nice names. So in that tradition, it was, I think, the schizoid, the oral, the psychopathic, the masochistic, and the rigid. And now they sound a bit more inviting. The reason is that Larry wanted to name them after the missing resource. So for what has been called schizoid in that tradition, they struggle with being connected. When you have a connection style, an individual who identifies with connection style, when it's in front of you in your practice, you might experience that as if not much is happening, as if it appears like, the person is not really emotional, or I don't know if it's effective, or there's not much happening. That's usually things I would hear from therapists. Because they struggle to be connected. And the reason is that the coping mechanism, the adaptation, is so early that it's based on dissociation. That it tunes out very quickly. It's fleeting, the moments of connection. But again, as we said before, it doesn't mean that it's not there. You just have to change, you refine the perception. Because there are moments of connection in the session. They're just maybe much smaller than you would expect them. And if you fine-tune your perception, you can start to see them. They look small on the outside, but for the persons, they are big. Or when you work with this attunement, people who identify with this attunement structure, you might have a client who can barely say what he or she actually wants, and if they say it a little bit, they're so quick in saying, well, that just is not even worth connecting to, or what would that change? And, anyhow, there's nobody there for me. Where some life force, is activated, and then it collapses so quickly. And that also can make therapists helpless, for good reasons. If you don't understand what's underlying here, that this upsurge of a life force of vitality is threatening to the child consciousness, and it goes into collapse as a strategy. And again, you can learn to see these moments. My way to NARM led with working with somebody who identified with the trust survival style, and that was kind of 12, 15 years ago. There was the client I was struggling with the most. I was still in training, and she would say things to me like, how old are you again? Or do you know what trauma means? Do you actually know what you're doing here? And I thought, oh, okay, probably not. I'm maybe doing the wrong job. So it was very challenging for me to work with that person. And one day she brought a book and said, you should read this. And it was Healing Developmental Trauma by Lawrence Heller. And I read it, and then I applied for the training. But this was a person for whom it was so difficult to trust that you feel constantly checked out if you have what it takes to be a therapist, if you're good enough. And you, of course, you start to feel that. So that was just one example with this trust theme. And if you work with an individual who identifies on the autonomy spectrum, you have these phenomena that can be also frustrating when you are a therapist. That is, for example, that you make a really good session and then the person asks in the end, that was really lovely, and then what shall I do with this now? Like, what now? So do you have homework? Do you have advice? And then maybe you give homework and then somehow they forget to do it. And they say, yeah, but can you give me something again or advice? When the sense of autonomy, of being your own agent, is compromised, you constantly orient towards the outside. But at the same time, you get very frustrated when somebody tells you what to do. So that's also kind of a own thing to work with these survival styles then. And we'll spend a lot of time, of course, in the training to go much deeper here. Just one or two sentences to the love sexuality theme. It basically describes the struggle of being open in your heart and being sexual at the same time, which many people, of course, meet in their long-term relationships, where they either feel attracted to the person or they feel romantically connected, but maybe not both at the same time. And then to which fear that actually connects if you would open up to, to both of these levels of experience. And you would find that people who identify with the fifth survival style, they're really motivated to perfect everything. And even the therapeutic process, there will be these great clients who feel into their hearts and who can cry and who can be angry and who work towards being this very perfect person and also perfect NARM client. But something quite doesn't maybe connect on a really deeper level of the heart or of the self, And I'm just naming examples, knowing that I leave out parts of the complexity of what these survival styles means, just to give you a little bit of a taste here. Okay, let's see. So maybe let's have this slide and then we go to a short exchange. It's called the neuroaffective relational model because the relational aspect is the most important part of the model. The relation between client and therapist, but more important, the relation to self. So you could also say NARM is a therapy of self-relation. And the therapeutic relationship is just the vessel, the necessary vessel, because we can't do it alone, to help clients to connect back more into their self-relation and to discover those aspects where they actually really don't relate to themselves or ignore their experience or reject it. And this is also based in the assumption, basically, that every processed or every unprocessed emotion, it carries a relational aspect, a relational message. And that is what we mean by emotional completion. You can, when you look at emotions cathartically, as if they're some energy that builds up and that you need to release it somewhere, then you're missing out on the fact that emotions are carriers of relational information. So cathartic work goes wrong where you look at emotions like there's something to mechanically regulate or to act out to be free from them again. Like a bucket that's full that you pour out and then you feel better. But the whole point of emotions is that they are relational. They exist in a relational context. And every unprocessed emotion lives in an object relational context and of course, that relates to our early upbringing. So there are all these little or big messages or sentences that we did not express towards our parents or caregivers because we couldn't. It was not safe and we didn't have access to them. But in therapy, we encourage clients to find words for the emotions. And then you see that these words are, of course, relational. They have something to say to somebody. And when that comes in and opens up, that's part of the emotional completion process.